Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Al Jazeera reports Niger's junta released a French official held for 5 days. He was detained in Niger last week. He has been released, the French government said today. The arrest heightened tensions between France and Niger, where military officers deposed the elected president last month and ordered French officials to leave. For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So they released the French official held for 5 days, and the U.S. military resumes drone crewed aircraft operations in post-coup Niger as the U.S. reaches agreement with Niger's military leaders to restart the drone crewed aircraft missions. Dr. Horne, this is a bit confusing.
Well, I understand why you say that. As a matter of fact, it leads me to formulate what might be considered a joke, which is that actually the U.S. authorities in Niamey might have conspired with the Nigerian authorities to detain this French official. That apparent joke actually reveals a larger truth, which is exposed by your second story. That is to say, the United States resuming its drone operations. As we've been stressing repeatedly on these airwaves ever since the spate of regime changes in formerly French neocolonial Africa, it's no secret that the United States would like to elbow aside its erstwhile French ally and assume the pole position with regard to being in the privileged place concerning relationships with these regimes. Now, I should also mention that with regard to these emerging regimes, I trust that they're paying attention to the press. For example, in a recent issue of the Financial Times of London, they had a substantial piece virtually predicting where the next regime changes would come. They pointed to Cameroon in the first place, this neighbor of Nigeria, where 90-year-old Paul Biya has been ruling for decades. As the piece suggested, he's been wearing out his welcome in Switzerland, where he spends most of his time. In fact, the article was accompanied by a photograph of Cameroonian citizens or nationals or exiles demonstrating in front of his luxurious Geneva estate. I interpreted that piece as a signal to the folks in Africa that the investor class, as they say on Wall Street, have priced in the cost of further regime changes in Africa. That is to say, they're anticipating these regime changes, which in many ways is a signal to these folks in Cameroon, not to mention Equatorial Guinea and Togo, and perhaps even the Republic of the Congo, speaking of Congo-Brazzaville, that there is a signal from the North Atlantic investor class that they're willing to talk turkey if you're willing to oust these long-term autocrats that have been plundering their peoples and their countries. I trust and I take it that that is not taking place in Niger. What I mean is I trust and I take it that they're not looking, speaking of the new regime, to simply replace French neocolonial figures with the U.S. neocolonial figures, but as those of us who consider ourselves to be activists on behalf of peoples of African descent on this side of the Atlantic, we would be naive to dismiss this contention out of hand.
You know, Dr. Horne, when I look at what's happening there, also France has a problem. They're saying because Niger says, okay, your ambassador has to leave. France says, no, they're not going to leave. They say your troops has to leave. France says no, they're not going to leave, and they're kind of squeezed because when you look at what happened with the U.S. and AUKUS and the submarine deal, they would have to be suspicious that U.S. imperialism is up to no good. But there seems like they're trying to hold on. You know, they've got a white knuckle grip on the edge of the table, trying to hold on, and the people of Africa are trying to pull away, and the U.S. seems like they're up to no good now. Your thoughts?
Well, clearly France is in an abusive relationship with U.S. imperialism. That helps to shed light on why France made a futile attempt to join the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. This helps to explain why President Macron made a trip a few months ago to China with a plane load of business individuals, businessmen for the most part, seeking to broker new deals with the People's Republic of China, despite the fact that Washington is seeking to encircle China, as represented by President Biden's recent trip to Hanoi, Vietnam, of all places, to try to lure Vietnam into this encirclement process. This also sheds light upon a remarkable speech that President Macron gave some months ago, early 2023, at the Munich Security Conference in Germany, an annual gathering. Recall that it was in 2007 at that event in particular that President Putin gave a warning to the North Atlantic countries that their so-called rules-based international order was fraying at the seams and was certainly unsustainable. If that speech had been attended to, perhaps the North Atlantic countries would not be involved in this debacle in Ukraine. But in any case, President Macron issued what are called in the U.S. discourse precriminations, not recriminations. In other words, he was already pointing to the debacle unfolding in Ukraine and telling his comrades in the North Atlantic bloc that, yes, he went along with this, but he didn't think it was a good idea at the time. And that also represents this idea that France is becoming an unreliable ally for U.S. imperialism, which I think opens up opportunities, particularly for those in Africa who are conducting a dual struggle against both French imperialism and U.S. imperialism. The distinct possibility has arisen to play one off against another, and in the process, perhaps even introduce fissures into the European Union itself, putting added pressure on Germany, the locomotive of the European Union, now under 8 decades long occupation by U.S. imperial forces. And so, once again, I think it's possible to suggest, at least tentatively, that we are on the brink, if we are not in the midst of a Copernican change in the global correlation of forces, not unlike what unfolded post-1945 when the United States was bestriding the world like a latter-day colossus. But this time, we see the shrinkage of the hegemonic role of that erstwhile colossus, which opens up enormous opportunities, not only for international peace and security, but also for economic development and lifting millions, if not billions, out of the poverty to which they have been consigned by the imperialist bloc.
Sputnik International reports Pentagon misleads Congress about number of bases in Africa. The U.S. Department of Defense has lied to Congress about its shady activities in Africa, according to Tunde Osasua. He explained that General Michael Langley, commander of the U.S. Africa Command, had briefed Congress on the military's facilities in Africa, including the enduring forward operating sites at some sites in Djibouti and the Ascension Islands. He claimed that they're minimal. You know, looking at this picture, Dr. Horne, and the story, it just brought back memories of another black general misleading Congress about activities in Iraq. His name was Colin Powell. That's him. That's the guy. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Colin Luther Powell, indeed, a misleader of the first rank. One with more sympathy for the leaders of U.S. imperialism than myself would probably have a bit more sympathy. What I mean is that there's so many U.S. bases all around the world that it's easy to lose track of how many exist. how many exist in Africa, not least. And then there's the added problem, which is that audits of the Pentagon, quite generally, are virtually non-existent, believe it or not. That is to say, despite the fact that many cabinet-level departments have a so-called inspector general, whose duty is not only to ride herd on officials who turn into miscreants, but to keep track of the dollars that are being spent. But we know that with regard to these billions being poured into the Ukraine, one of the reasons why you see these State Department and Pentagon officials magically materializing with this idea that, you know what, we're not really sure how many billions we poured into Ukraine. And in fact, Congress's authorization has not been exhausted, so we can pour in ever more billions. That's a reflection of this lack of inspector general with fundamentals of accounting principles in his or her resume, but also the general lack of auditing of how our tax dollars are being spent. Now, we all know that if these tax dollars were going towards healthcare and education, the numbers would be fly-spec to a fairly well. But with regard to the Pentagon, not so much.
Sanctioned Zimbabwe and Cuba vow cooperation, expanding economic ties. Just ahead of the G77 summit, the ambassador to Cuba is meeting with representatives from Zimbabwe. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, this is an exemplar of a global trend. What I mean is, couple that Zimbabwe-Cuban article with the recent summit in Vladivostok of Chairman Kim of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and President Putin of the Russian Federation. What I mean is that the United States, in particular, is sanctioning so many countries that they're forcing these countries into alliances. Let me also reference in that context that it was just a few months ago that President Lukashenko of Belarus was in Harare, Zimbabwe. Of course, he and his country are in the ranks of the sanctioned as well, not least because of his reluctance and failure to break ties with Moscow. And that's led to a flourishing relationship between Zimbabwe and Belarus. Now, this relationship with Cuba, I dare say, would have gone on even without both being sanctioned. The dual sanctions only drives them closer together because we all know that it was Cuban forces that helped to liberate that part of Africa. It was the threat, in fact, that Cuban forces would intervene militarily in Rhodesia, the predecessor state of Zimbabwe, in the late 1970s, that introduced some reason into the Rhodesian authorities and forced them to the negotiating table in London that led to Zimbabwean independence in 1980. So this story that you just referenced has a certain logic to it, and we can only salute it.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.